Choice can be a big part of video games. Sometimes gameplay consists almost entirely of choices, but most stories in video games can't be determined by the player. Instead, players follow a linear story. Both modes of storytelling are fine on their own, but I personally get excited when I have the option to choose. It lets me put myself in the game and decide how I want the story to go, which is great for such an interactive medium. That's why it's really upsetting when I come across the illusion of choice. This is when it seems like the player will have control over the story, but the game in fact has a completely linear, predetermined plot. I recently played Final Fantasy X for the first time. There's two moments where you're given a choice of saying whether you love Yuna or not. The first is Wakka asking if you think she's cute, and the second is when Lulu tells you not to fall in love with her. But even if you say she's not my type, and you promise Lulu that you won't fall in love, or even if you say that you like Lulu, your character still falls in love with Yuna. It's a bit ironic for a game that pretty clearly emphasizes free will over determinism. Now, I have nothing wrong with Tidus and Yuna getting together. They fall in love, Tidus wants to stop Yuna from dying, and he dies instead. It's a good story, but it should have been presented as the only possible story. As it is, I couldn't help but feel annoyed when my choices didn't matter. I thought I had the option to have a romance with Yuna, or not have a romance, when in fact I had no options at all. The game has a whole lot of other dialogue choices like this, which only affect the conversation and not the overall story, so the lack of choice is forgivable. Even though you can't make any major decisions, you still get to control the outcome of individual conversations. In the last story, though, you sometimes aren't given any control, even though it appears you are. The choices played up way too much for me to excuse it. The Last Story is an excellent game, with great music, creative combat, good voice acting, and a fun story. But there's a few elements of the game that made it a worse experience than it had to be. One of those was the illusion of choice. There's two big moments where you're given two options, but you actually can only choose one. If you choose the other, the game just stops. When you have the choice to join the Count's army, you have to say yes to get the story going. Otherwise, the game just tells you to come back when you've changed your mind. This is a really bad game mechanic. Games can vary their pacing, but they should never come to a complete standstill. And for some players this really can come to a standstill, because the game convinces you beforehand that you do have a choice. There's so much build up for this big decision. The characters keep bringing it up and saying how important it is to consider what choice you make. So when I said no, and the game wouldn't let me, I thought I was just missing something. I went out and kept playing until I realized I had to say yes, and that was extremely disappointing. And when the story did continue, I was pretty upset when I had to watch Callista get angry for a decision I didn't even want to make. Later the game gives you pretty much the same two options. You can either swear allegiance to the Count and become a knight, or you can abandon the army and escape with Callista. But just like before, there's actually only one option. If you try to join the Count, Zale asks himself why he decided to become a knight in the first place, and the two choices pop back up. This will happen no matter how many times you try to say yes. So your only option is to say no. I take my virtual choices pretty seriously, so I spent a long time sitting in front of the screen before coming to a decision. I fortunately picked the right option and had a good time, but if I had tried going the other way, I would have been irritated that I couldn't, and it really would have broken the immersion for me. No game should give you two choices and force you to only make one. I really have no idea why the game makers chose to do this at all. Did they want to make the player feel powerless? Am I supposed to realize that Zale is his own person, and that nobody can control anybody else? Maybe, but even if the creators had some grand goal or theme in mind, it doesn't come through, and really it just ends up being an annoying game mechanic that disrupts the flow of the game. The rest of the game works well with its linear story. The creators should have just stuck with that, instead of presenting these fake choices. Any illusion of choice is inconvenient, but it's a particular problem in these two moments because they halt the game. One keeps you locked within this false act of decision making, and the other can cause a couple hours of pointless wondering. Choices can work well in games, and so can linear stories, but a game should never give players hope for something that it won't provide. The Last Story does a lot right, but its focus on these choices that, in the end, aren't choices, gives players expectation and disappointment that could have easily been avoided. I hope you enjoyed my first game analysis video. Next week I'll be talking about To the Moon, which I think is sad, but for a very different reason than why most people think it's sad, and which ultimately makes the main character a pretty bad person. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.